If today feels a little clearer, like something is starting to make sense again, even if it's not fully resolved, this isn't random. There's a shift happening in your perception. Not a full return to clarity, but a gradual lifting of what felt unclear before. You might notice small realizations, things that didn't fully make sense yesterday starting to come into focus. Not all at once, but in pieces. Subtle insights, quiet recognitions, moments where something clicks without needing much effort. And at the same time, there's still some uncertainty. Not everything is fully defined yet. Some things still feel incomplete, still in transition, still forming. So you're not fully grounded, but you're not lost either. You're somewhere in between confusion and understanding, between distortion and clarity. And that space feels different, less overwhelming, less reactive, but more reflective. You may find yourself looking back at recent moments, reconsidering things, seeing situations from a different angle, understanding something now that didn't feel clear before. And that shift can feel stabilizing because you're starting to regain a sense of direction, not perfectly, but enough to feel like you're reconnecting to what's real. This is the after effect of Mars moving through Neptune's influence. The intensity hasn't disappeared, but the distortion is beginning to fade. And as it fades, your perception starts to reorganize. Not instantly, but gradually. So if today feels lighter, less confusing, more reflective, more aware, it's not because everything is suddenly clear. It's because the fog is lifting just enough for you to start seeing again. What you're experiencing today is not full clarity returning. It's the beginning of reorganization. The intensity from yesterday has not completely disappeared, but the distortion is weakening. Mars is moving past Neptune, and as that alignment separates, your perception begins to stabilize again. Not instantly, but enough for you to notice the difference. Yesterday, everything felt fluid, uncertain, hard to define, difficult to trust. Today, things start to hold their shape again, not perfectly, but more than before. You may notice that your thoughts feel less scattered, less reactive, more structured, not because you're forcing clarity, but because your awareness is naturally settling. This is how this kind of energy resolves. It doesn't flip from confusion to clarity instantly. It moves through a transition where perception begins to filter itself, separating what was real from what was influenced by distortion. And that process can feel reflective because you're not just seeing what's happening now, you're also reassessing what just happened, looking back at recent thoughts, recent feelings, recent decisions, and seeing them differently. Not in a way that creates panic, but in a way that creates understanding. You may realize that something you felt strongly yesterday doesn't feel as certain now, or something that seemed unclear is starting to make more sense. And that shift is not random. It's your perception recalibrating after being temporarily influenced. Because Neptune doesn't just create illusion, it dissolves boundaries, it blends things together. So during that phase, it's harder to separate intuition from projection, reality from interpretation. But as that influence begins to fade, those boundaries return, gradually, and with them comes the ability to distinguish again. Not everything becomes clear immediately, but enough becomes clear to guide your next step. That's what you're feeling today. Not complete certainty, but regained orientation. a sense of direction returning to your awareness. And that's the shift, from distortion to recognition. This is where today can quietly shift off balance. Because as clarity begins to return, the instinct is to fix everything, to go back, reevaluate, correct, adjust quickly. Because now you can see more, and that awareness can feel urgent. You might look at something from yesterday and feel like you got it wrong, that you misread a situation, misinterpreted a feeling, moved too quickly or not clearly enough. And that can trigger a reaction, a need to correct, to undo, to explain, to shift direction immediately. But this is where it becomes subtle. Not everything you see now requires action. Some of it is simply understanding. And understanding doesn't always need correction. That's the first trap. Assuming that clarity means you need to act on it immediately. But clarity is information, not always instruction. The second trap is overcorrection, trying to swing too far in the opposite direction. If something felt uncertain yesterday, you may try to make it overly certain today. If something felt unclear, you may try to define it too quickly. If something felt off, you may try to fix it all at once. And that creates a different kind of imbalance, because you're still reacting, just from a different place. Not from confusion, but from urgency to resolve confusion. And both can lead to misalignment. There's also a quieter pattern today, self-judgment. Looking back and questioning yourself. Not just your decisions, but your ability to trust your own perception. And that can create doubt. Not the same kind as yesterday, but more reflective, more analytical. And if you stay in that space too long, it pulls you away from the clarity that is actually returning. Because clarity doesn't come from judgment, it comes from observation. So the real calibration today is restraint, not from movement, but from reaction. You don't need to fix everything you now understand. You don't need to respond to every realization. You just need to let clarity stabilize, without interrupting it. Because what is truly aligned will remain clear, even if you don't act on it immediately. And what is not will continue to shift until it no longer holds. So instead of reacting to what you see now, stay with it. Let it settle. Let it become stable. Because clarity that is rushed becomes distortion again, and clarity that is allowed becomes direction. So, how do you work with this returning clarity without turning it into another reaction? You slow down what you do with it, not the clarity itself, but your response to it. Because clarity is still stabilizing. It's not fully formed yet. And when something is still forming, it needs space. So instead of asking, what should I fix, shift the focus. What is becoming clear? And does it remain clear over time? Let clarity prove itself, not just in one moment, but across multiple moments. Because what is truly aligned stays consistent. It doesn't disappear when you stop thinking about it. It doesn't change every time you look at it again. So give things a little time today. If something feels obvious, let it stay obvious without acting on it immediately. If something feels off, observe it without rushing to correct it. Because stability comes from consistency, not immediacy. You can also simplify your movement today, not by doing less, but by doing what is already clear. Focus on what doesn't require overthinking, what feels straightforward, what feels grounded, what doesn't shift when you revisit it. Let those actions lead and allow everything else to remain open. You don't need to resolve every uncertainty today. Some things will become clearer on their own, without pressure, without forcing them into definition. You can also bring awareness into how you interpret your realizations. Not everything you understand today is a problem to solve. Some of it is simply information, context, perspective. And when you treat it that way, you remove the urgency to act on it, which allows clarity to deepen instead of destabilize. You may also notice that your pace feels different, less rushed, less reactive, more intentional. That's not a loss of momentum, that's controlled movement. And that's what this phase is for. Not to stop, but to move with awareness instead of reaction. So, today, let clarity guide you, but don't let it rush you. Because when clarity is given space, it becomes direction. And direction doesn't need to be forced. Let everything settle here. Not the clarity itself, but your need to act on it. Because today was not about finding answers, it was about seeing again. After a phase where perception was unclear, where things felt uncertain, where not everything could be trusted, you're beginning to recognize what holds. Not perfectly, but enough to feel the difference. So take a breath. Steady, controlled, unforced, and notice what remains when you're not trying to change anything. There's a quiet clarity here, not loud, not urgent, but stable. It doesn't push you, it doesn't demand action, it simply stays. And that's how you know it's real. Because what is aligned doesn't need to convince you. It doesn't need to be repeated, it doesn't need to be forced into certainty. It holds on its own. So not everything you saw today needs to become a decision. Not everything you realized needs to be acted on immediately. Some of it is just awareness returning. And awareness needs time to stabilize. Because clarity that is rushed becomes distortion again. But clarity that is allowed becomes direction. So as you move forward from here, you don't need to correct everything. You don't need to define everything. You don't need to respond to every realization. You just need to stay present with what remains consistent. Because consistency is what turns clarity into something you can trust. And if something fades, let it fade. Because what is real will remain, without effort, without pressure, without needing your constant attention. So carry that with you, this ability to see without reacting immediately. And if this helped you feel more grounded, even slightly, return to it when things begin to feel unclear again. And if you want to keep moving through these shifts with more awareness, more stability, you can come back here. Each day, not to find answers, but to stay aligned as clarity returns.